reading this wonderful book, The Burning Chambers, has been an absolute treat. It's been an absolute joy. I found myself drawn further and further into this world, the world of 16th century France, very, very turbulent period. And my first question, sort of to get us going, because it's something that I thought about when I was reading, was to ask Kate, why did you choose to write in the historical genre? And could you possibly also talk a little bit about if there were any influences for that?
Sure, thank you, Kate. Yes, quite often when I'm interviewed by another Kate, we have to resort to surnames because it's so confusing doing this. And I once did an event in South Africa, actually, where the chair and all three of us on the panel were Kate. So there were 4 Kates on the panel. So it's just one of those things, that age.
Yes,
but it's nice to be here. I wish we could be together in person. We nearly made it, but it's lovely so many of you have tuned in this morning. Well, the thing for me is, Kate H, that all of my historical fiction really are love letters to the Languedoc, the southwest of France, to Carcassonne in particular, and to Toulouse and the mountains. And I first went there, my husband and I bought a tiny little house in the shadow of the medieval city walls of Carcassonne 31 years ago now, when, you know, a long time before any of this. And we went there for the very first time. There were no flights, no Ryanair at the time. And we arrived at this extraordinary city. And it was November, it was this time of year, it was this type of weather. I don't know what it's like in your bit of Sussex, but in my bit, it's pouring with rain today. The South Downs are drenched. And we walked through the town and it was completely silent. And we got to the Pont Vieux, which goes over the River Aude, which separates the modern town, the Bastide, which is 14th century, from the medieval citadel, which sits on the hill opposite. And we walked onto the Pont Vieux, and I saw for the first time this incredible place, Carcassonne, 52 towers and turrets, 2 rings of wall, this perfect walled city. And I just fell in love. And it was that, really. And it was wanting to know the history of that part of France. And out of that came a novel called Labyrinth, which is set in the 13th century, and the 2 that followed, Sepulchre and Citadel, which are fin de siècle and then Second World War. And so all of my historical writing comes from landscape and place and wanting to know who lived here before in the past, what made this land what it is. So if you like, the lead character in all of my fiction is landscape, and that comes back from being one of those mournful teenage girls who walked around clutching a copy of Wuthering Heights and wondering why nobody realized how terribly miserable I was, you know, that sort of thing. But with the current series, The Burning Chambers and The City of Tears, which should have been out by now, but it will come out in January, and the 2 that follow. Funnily enough, they started on the other side of the world, the Carcassonne. And I was in a book festival talking about one of my Languedoc trilogy in a beautiful place called Franschhoek. Some of you might know it, it's in the winelands of South Africa. And I didn't know anything about the town. It's a white frontier town, a Dutch Cape Colony town, about 30 kilometers east of Cape Town. And I was picked up and we were driving along and we were, you know, coming through Stellenbosch and the winelands. And I noticed as we got closer and closer that the names on all the wineries became French. You know, they had been Afrikaans or Xhosa or English, or, you know, possibly, you know, German Lutheran, you know, all of these influences. But suddenly I saw that we were seeing wineries called La Grande Provence, Petite Provence, all of these things. And as we got into the heart of the town, I noticed that the central street in Franschhoek is called Huguenot Street. I thought, you know, this is quite surprising. So I said to my driver, I didn't know there was a French history here. And he said, oh, didn't you know that the word Franschhoek means the French corner? And out of that, I ran to the museum when I had any time off from doing the book festival and discovered the most incredible piece of history, which was this, that the Dutch East India Company had invaded and stolen the land in southern Africa. They were using the Cape as a staging post for their colonies in the Far East. And the governor realized that the land in South Africa, in that part, Franschhoek area, was the same as the land in Languedoc in southwest France. And the Huguenots had been forced to leave France in the wars of religion of the 15th, 16th century. And he sent word back to Amsterdam and said, if there are any southern French refugees who we have given a home to in Amsterdam or Rotterdam, who would be prepared to come to Southern Africa, we will pay for your passage on a ship. We will pay for a French pastor to go with you. We will give you a piece of land and tools, and we will give you vines. And out of that extraordinary request, 7 Huguenot families who were refugees in Amsterdam sailed. And out of that, almost not completely exclusively, but out of that, we have the South African wine industry. And this history just blew me away. And so, of course, the minute I knew this, I thought, okay, where does the story need to start? Well, of course, it needs to start back in my beloved Carcassonne. It needs to start on the eve of the Wars of Religion in 1562, and it will end in Franschhoek in 1862 with descendants of those families who started the wine industry in South Africa. So that's a long answer, and I promise they won't all be that long. Encapsulating everything. So back I went at the very beginning.
Absolutely fascinating, Kate, and that leads, so that fascinating, and not what I expected. I kind of expected a kind of
I know, that's why
fell in love with history. So it's kind of, it's lovely to get a really surprising answer, because Kate must have fallen in love with history, blah, blah, this period, but no, actually it's all about place. So interesting. And the places are, of course, so powerfully evocative in the book. You know, I don't know, I've been to that bit of France once, don't know it very well, but from the book, I kind of feel I'm walking those streets with your wonderful characters. So that's interesting. Takes me to 2 places. I think, given where we finished up, which is in Franschhoek, I'm intrigued by the prologue. So you've described this journey for yourself of being interested in falling in love with Southwest France, and then being at the book festival in Cape Town, going out to Franschhoek and saying, I have to tell this story. And then, as you just said, deciding actually where did the story start? Well, it starts in 16th century Carcassonne. So what's the purpose of the prologue, which is, for anybody who hasn't read the book, is it's 1862 in a graveyard in Franschhoek.
Well, I think of myself not as a historical writer, actually. I think of myself as an adventure writer. And I grew up with my wonderful dad, who sadly is no longer with us. He read me as my bedtime stories, the stories he had liked as a boy. You know, my dad fought in the Second World War, so he was a man of that age. So he read me Rider Haggard and Jules Verne and all of those, you know, those stories which are all about jeopardy and excitement and action, and, you know, people being brave and coming through adversity. And I enjoy those stories. And so the Burning Chambers series, it is an epic, if you like. And I wanted to start where we were going to finish in 1862, because the series in the end is a Romeo and Juliet story, one Catholic family, one Huguenot family. It's a story of missing relics and a feud that lasts 300 years. And it's a story of the Huguenot diaspora from France to Amsterdam, to the Canary Islands, in my case, and then finally finding a home in South Africa, in Franschhoek. And so I wanted, if you like, to say to my readers, we're going on this journey together, where I hate that phrase, we're going on a journey, but in this case, it is actively true, because we are going over the rest of the world, if you like. And I wanted people to know that there was going to be, if you like, that Rider Haggard adventure story at the end. So it starts in the graveyard in 1862, partly because my first inspiration for the series was in that graveyard when I stood in Franschhoek. And it was because all stories of refugees, of course, are by definition sad, because they are about people being forced to leave the home or the land that they love through no fault of their own, and forced to travel wherever, you know, Fiddler on the Roof is a refugee story. You know, all of these stories, we know what they are. But I was also interested in trying to tell a more positive story. And when I stood in the graveyard, the Huguenot graveyard in Franschhoek, you know, as my modern self in 2010, which is when I first started thinking about this series, I looked up at the mountains surrounding the town and I thought, oh, they look like the mountains of Southwest France. And suddenly I had this idea for my story, because I'm not an historian, although I love history. If I wanted to write a history of the Huguenot diaspora, I would write one. But as a novelist, what you're looking for is your glimmer, your characters, your story that sits against the backdrop of real history, that makes it yours. And when I stood there, I thought, oh, I see. Just imagine being a young woman in 1862, which is roughly the date of the town, and looking up at those mountains and having carried inside you a story from your mother and your grandmother and your great-great-grandmother and her great-great-grandmother, going back 300 years of the land your family were forced to leave, that you don't even know, but you arrive here and you look at these mountains and you think, oh, this could be home. So it was very important to me that it could be a positive refugee story, if you like, for all the heartbreak and all the tragedy and all the massacres and all the terrible things that happen. The idea that there can be a new life and there can be resolution. So I thought, well, if I start the prologue of the Burning Chambers, the prologue of the City of Tears, the prologue of the third book will all be in 1862 in Franschhoek, and book 4 is in Franschhoek. So we know we're going to get all the answers when it comes to it. Possibly book 5. It depends how well I get on.
I can't wait. That sounds so interesting and exciting. That leads me on to a question. I mean, obviously, in the 2010s and in 2020, we live in a period of refugee crisis. I mean, refugees been around, as you know, as you're saying, for a very, very long time, but it sort of feels very acute and very present. And the refugees in your books, your series, caused by religious fervour and intolerance. And your prologue has this extraordinary couple of sentences. The history of the injustices done in the name of religion to her ancestors surely prove that there is no God. For what God would allow so many to die in agony and fear and terror in his name? And I wondered how much, as you were writing, the resonance of stuff that's happening today around religious intolerance and around, relatedly, our refugee situation, how much were you aware of that resonance?
Well, of course, I'm aware of it, but I think it's really important, and everybody listening who are readers, like I'm a reader, you know, we will all know this, that historical fiction or adventure fiction only works if it is set completely in the time in which it's set and with the attitudes of that time. So whenever somebody tries to shoehorn in modern attitudes, historical fiction fails, because that isn't how people would have thought. So as I said, I started to have a glimmer of the idea of this series in 2010, that's 10 years ago now. And the world wasn't quite in the state it is at the moment for all sorts of reasons. But everything about the things that we see on the news, and indeed we've been seeing this year on the news with the pandemic, is just a reminder of why I think people love historical fiction, is that history is not a straight line. Things do not every year improve for more and more people. We do not learn. Humankind is a wonderful thing, but a very flawed thing, and it goes backwards and forwards. So history is a pendulum. And what is very interesting as a historical writer at the moment, particularly with the pandemic happening, is in my period of history, this period, 16th century, people lived with the idea of a plague arriving every single day of their lives. You know, everybody had lost somebody to the plague, and the plague came around every 5 years. And the idea that everybody would then be locked into a town or have to stay inside, that was commonplace. And so as a writer, obviously I'm not writing about that specifically, but that does help me as a historical writer, thinking, God, yes, that's how that feels. The idea that there's an invisible enemy, you know, if you like, and we've all lived through that and adjusted how we live. People did that every single year in the 16th century. With the issue of refugees, what I always have is that we as readers bring our modern ideas and our modern selves to any book that we read. But my job as the writer is to put authentic ideas of the 16th century on the page. But I am interested in particularly at the moment, and I'm sure all of us, in whatever our politics are, feel the same, that I feel a distress about the lack of civility in public discourse. I feel a distress that people cannot disagree in a polite and human way. You know, my parents, my mother-in-law, we're all different generations. We all had different political point of view, but it didn't mean that we couldn't listen to the other point of view. And I think what we've seen about, you know, what I was very conscious of writing my refugees, if you like, is that they don't see themselves as refugees. They are just people. And some people, when my family arrive, as they will in book 2 in Amsterdam, because this is, The Burning Chambers is about the beginning of the wars of religion. And right at the beginning, my lead character, Minou, goes into the Bastille to her father's bookshop, and she opens up the bookshop for that day. And as she walks down the street, she talks to her converso friends, and they are Jewish people who have fled the Inquisition in Spain. She is a Catholic, but she talks to her Huguenot friends. She talks to her friends, the horror of horrors, that are atheists, because they were seen as the worst. And there were Muslim families in Carcassonne. The point is that nobody defined themselves like that. In the same way that I suspect most of us don't want to define ourselves by those ways. You know, I say when I define myself, I say I'm a writer and I come from Chichester. I don't say I'm this color or that color or look like this or whatever. And I am interested in that, how through historical fiction, we can, if we experience the lives of characters, we fall in love with those characters. And you can see how good friends and neighbors are forced to define themselves as Huguenot or Catholic when they never thought like that. But the powers that be have said, these people are your enemy. And if you don't stand against them, then you are our enemy too. So, and that is what matters to me in historical fiction, that sometimes we can see the present by looking at the past. But it's, you know.
Thank you. That was a very fascinating and quite actually quite challenging answer, but certainly one for me to mull on. I think it leads me on to I want to now talk a little bit about your characters who are so powerful and so and I sort of feel that they're my friends. I feel I kind of know them. You, unlike some, and I think what you said about adventure hit stories and Rider Haggard and so on maybe goes some way to answering this, but in much historical fiction, the author focuses on the powerful. They focus on the kings, the queens, the dukes, the people with land, the people with power, the people with political sway, etc. Almost exclusively, there's not the occasional powerful character who would pop in, but almost exclusively you write about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances rather than the powerful and the famous. That must have been a choice at some point, and I'd love to understand more about how you made that choice.
Yes, it absolutely, it's deliberate. I am interested as a novelist in telling a ripping good yarn, a really great adventure story where people want to turn the page to discover what's happening. That's what I'm interested in. Readers having a really great time reading my book, and when they finish going, wow, that was worth the time. You know, because everybody has a lot of pressure on their time. You know, I want people to enjoy my books as stories. That's it, first and foremost. Beyond that, though, I'm interested in telling in history the unheard and the underheard stories. So almost all of my lead characters are women, because the thing is, we were there too. And often when you read history, you could be forgiven, you know, like in Lord of the Rings, you know, there's always the joke in Lord of the Rings, in the Dwarf Kingdom, that there are no women in the Dwarf Kingdom. You know, have you seen any women? And all of this sort of thing. So for me, quite often history has been written from, as you say, the point of view of the powerful, which historically has tended to be kings, generals, religious leaders, which by definition has left out many of the female stories. But of course, in my period, in the Burning Chambers and the City of Tears is coming next, the men have been at war on and off for a generation. They're not there. So who do we think is opening the bookshop? Who do we think is baking the bread? Who do we think actually is looking after the cattle and building the houses? Well, of course, it's all of the rest of us. And I do feel very strongly, particularly in the 16th century, that we focus far too much on just the handful of people at the top and forget that almost everything about history is us. Now, there might be kings and queens listening in today at this book festival, but mostly it is all of us. And as you will have realized from how I talk, I loved my parents very dearly and admired them very greatly, and my grandparents, and I'm very much a family person. And that's what I'm interested in, the real stories of the people who were there too. And so trying to put women center stage and ordinary men and women who do extraordinary things center stage. You know, in the last few weeks of my dad's life, I was his carer partly with my mum, and he talked for the very first time about his war and the things that he'd seen in the war. He'd never wanted to talk about it before. And as always, I would sit there and think, it's all the quiet people who have done the amazing things. Their courage is what interests me. Their ability to stand firm and have integrity and be brave and stand up for the people who cannot stand up for themselves. I am more interested in those stories than I am in another king, you know, riding out to war. And so that is very much the focus of my books, trying to put real people's history on the page, and researching it to a huge level so that we know the way that a normal bookseller and his family would have lived in Carcassonne in 1562. You know, that's what I love people saying. I never knew that people would have done this or that or eaten that. And that matters to me a lot more than another edict or a papal bull.
Yeah, and I think that is, for me as a reader, that was fantastically successful in the way it sort of drew me in and made me feel really part of these characters' lives. And I'm interested, by the way, I'm going to call them the hero characters, by which I mean quite a large cast, actually. The hero characters develop over the course of the book. So Minou, your fabulous, wonderful, enchanting heroine, Guit, Aymeric, Alice, Monsieur Joubert, and then two other women. It's so interesting what you said about women just then. I hadn't really noticed it. But then, of course, there's Madame Bousset and Madame Noubel. So there is Minou, but these two other wonderful female characters. And they all seem to grow in the course of the narrative. They grow in stature, complexity, and critically in courage. I guess Madame Bousset particularly sort of almost transforms from this slightly shy, slightly silly, slightly also almost all sort of supporting cast, let's say, into this kind of almost heroic character. I mean, it's just wonderful what happens with Madame Bousset. Do you plan that when you're writing? Do you plan that? Do you know that that's where they're going to go, or as you write, do they emerge into their light, if you like?
Now, I love that, Kate, that you use supporting character, because you have totally put your finger on how I work, which is that I do an insane amount of research so that I know the landscape of the world and the history of the world like the back of my hand, as it were. And then that feels like building the stage set. And then I have the idea of the sort of story I want to tell. So it will be imaginary characters against a backdrop of real history. And so I have an idea of the sort of lead character that I need to tell this story, but I don't know her. But I actually just kind of stand on my own in the middle of that empty stage and start writing. And so little by little, you know, my son is an actor actually, and I write plays, my husband is a playwright. And it feels like there are actors waiting in the wings, and little by little, they kind of come in to stand on the stage beside me. And I'm sure some of the people listening today will have seen the stage show of Les Mis. My son is the Marius, he plays Marius at the moment. And there's a song called Empty Chairs at Empty Tables, where all of the ghosts of all the people who have died come and stand next to him. And then they go in front of him so he can see them again. And then they vanish back, the ghosts, into the past. And that is exactly how it feels for me. So I start writing, people kind of come onto the stage, and there's a moment at which Minou, in this case, turns around and looks at me and says, okay, I'm here, let's do this. You know, I'm the person you're going to tell this story with. And then people come in, depending on what I need. So I knew that it needed to be a Catholic family and a Huguenot family. And I didn't know whether Minou was going to be Catholic or Huguenot at that stage. But the more research I did, the more I realized there were not that many Huguenots in Carcassonne. So all of these things. You mentioned Madame Bousset. She's an older woman, and by which I mean in that period of time in her 40s. So to all of us, a young woman. And she, I needed Minou to go to Toulouse for the story, where there is a big massacre in May 1562, when the wars of religion have just started. But she would not have been able to go, Minou, if there was not a female member in that household. So I needed an aunt in that household. That's why she's there. I started to write her, and she was a silly woman. She was very much, you know, always talking about her ruffs and her collars. And then I was writing a scene, part based on real history, where a funeral was interrupted. A woman had converted to being a Huguenot. Her husband and the Huguenot family were taking her to be buried. Her former Catholic family came and tried to steal the coffin. It's a real Montague Capulet moment. And as they tried to steal the coffin falls and the body falls out. And this is a piece of research that I discovered in the archives in Toulouse of this incident. And I have Minou and her aunt Mosse there, and I have Minou reaching out to touch her aunt's hand. And as she does that, her aunt flinches. And I found myself typing a description of her cuff falling down and Minou seeing bruises on her aunt's wrist. And at that moment, I suddenly thought, oh, I see. You seem silly because you're actually a battered wife and you cover it all up with all this fluffiness. And I honestly promise you, Kate, it was as if Aunt Mosse turned around and said, about time. You thought I was in the ensemble, but actually I'm a supporting lead. And that is how it works for me. So the minute I realized that, I thought, that's why you're here in this book. And of course, she takes over and takes over. And I always, any of my familiar readers who've read all of my work will know that there is in every book at least one old woman. Partly because I'm a carer and partly I spend a lot of time with people in their 80s and their 90s, but also because I'm a great fan of Miss Marple, the great unsung heroine of literature, and that idea that the old women are always overlooked, are left in the corner, but they hear everything and they know everything, and they very often are the hero because they've seen it all and they have courage. And so Aunt Mosse became that person in the book for me. And when I was launching the book, everywhere I went, people would come up to me and say, oh, but you know, there were two favorites apart from the leads. They were Blanche, who's my very glamorous, rather sexy baddie woman, and Aunt Mosse, who is my woman who saves the day. So, and I love that. That's what I love about being a novelist, that I don't plan, because you need to be open to the characters saying, here I am, take me or leave me. And that's the most exciting moment of being a novelist, is when a character takes over.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely wonderful, and I absolutely adored Aunt Mosse. And there's another powerful older woman, of course, in Madame Nouvelle. We actually have two of these kind of powerful, wonderful older women who are supporting and driving. They're supporting, but they're also driving the story, and they both have extraordinary courage. You talked about Blanche then, and I'm intrigued by evil in the book. I think you have. You may not agree with this, but from my reader's perspective, I think we have two pretty evil characters. We have Blanche and we have Vidal. Interesting that other people ask about Blanche, because I'll come back to Vidal later if we have time, but Blanche, obviously she has a rich and deep backstory that you create very brilliantly. I don't know how to put this, sort of piece by piece, almost like little pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that drop in and starts to be intriguing, and you start to create a sort of sense of Blanche's very difficult backstory. And by the end, I'm not quite sure when it's clear she's mad, when it's clear she's insane, but at some point the reader becomes aware that she's bonkers. And so those things, to me at least, made her victim as well as villain. And I think that's beautifully underlined when Minou, every year on the anniversary of Blanche's death, Minou places flowers on Blanche's grave. So there's some sort of sense that, for me, that Minou has also come to understand that there was some more depth to Blanche. How important is it for you as the writer that your readers understand some of Blanche's complexity and depth?
Yeah. I mean, that's a lovely question, and of course it's really important, because I think that what often happens in stories is that it's easy to say, yes, oh, that person was evil, and that's why all these terrible things happened. But what we know, and we see it around us all the time, is that all it needs is for people who are greedy or want power or believe that other people matter less to pursue their goals, and other people to go along with it. So if you say that X is evil, then it absolves everybody from responsibility. Everybody in a given situation has a choice of how they behave. And so for me, the thing about Blanche is the absolute agent of destruction in the burning chambers. But she's been made like that. You know, there are things in her past that have made her become this person rather than that person. You know, so I think that everybody has innate characteristics, but equally, we all always make a choice all the time. You know, Minu makes a choice when she sees an injustice happening right at the very beginning of the novel, that she decides that rather than get out of the way of the soldiers because she doesn't want to get in trouble herself, that she will try to protect somebody. And we all, you know, some people, like my dad, maybe people listening, they have had their actual courage tested in whatever way that was. Some of us have not ever been face to face with a person with a gun who's saying, I'm going to shoot these people if you don't get out, you know, whatever. And so for me, I'm just interested in characters can never be wholly bad or wholly good, because that isn't what human beings are like. And I think it's very important that not so that you feel sympathy for Blanche because her choices are hers and she's terrible, but it doesn't come out of nowhere. And I think it's a danger quite often in thrillers that, oh, you know, well, it's fine, we can dismiss all of this because that person's mad or they're this, that, and the other. In the wars of religion, millions of people were tortured, executed, exiled, destroyed in the name of religion. And millions of people were involved in doing that. So it's the way in which a terrible thing can take over, a different way of seeing the world can take over, and how quickly it can happen. So Blanche, I want to be attractive and rather alluring, and she is, but in the end, you know, she can be stopped because she is just a human being. And it's, you know, in this case, they're both Catholic and they are using their Catholicism as a way of justifying the way they behave. And again, you know, we know that there's a great deal of good done in the world through people of faith and a great deal of bad done in the world through people of faith. And I think, you know we're living in very binary times at the moment where everybody who believes this seems terrible, everybody believes that. We know that the middle way is almost always the best way.
I'm going to ask you to read from your new book soon, but I want to ask you just one question before I do that, which is to ask about how the series develops. How does the first book set the scene for what follows? The second book, as Kate has said, City of Tears, is due to be published in January. I personally can't wait. Without giving too much
it now,
away,
Kate. It's
order it now
from your local independent bookseller. And the only reason I'm leaping in there is just that we're doing, because the high street is under such huge strain, we're doing a special edition for independent booksellers, which has got additional things in it. And normally I wouldn't be shameless in plugging my own. You don't have to order my book, you can order anybody else's book. But at the moment, if you order a book from an independent bookseller at the moment, it might make the difference between that bookseller surviving and not surviving. So you don't have to order my book, but they're all authors at the moment are trying to support independent booksellers in the second lockdown because it's a pretty perilous time for booksellers.
I'm going to order your book, partly because I might get some extra stuff, and partly because I can't wait to read it when it publishes in January, and I want it hot off the press. Could you tell us a little bit, without giving too much away, of where that book's going to take us?
Yes, so The Burning Chambers covers a very condensed period of time from the eve of the Wars of Religion, which start in France on the 1st of March 1562 with the Duke of Guise massacring in a place called Vassy in northern France a group of Protestants, Huguenots, that's just simply the name for the French Protestants, at prayer. And that sets off what is essentially a civil war that will go all the way till 1594, when the great French king, Henry IV, Henri IV, will unite France by converting from being a Protestant to being a Catholic, and he will be crowned in Chartres Cathedral. And that will end a generation of absolute mayhem, at which point France will have made herself a very weak country. And so book one, The Burning Chambers, is the beginning period, so from March to May 1562. The City of Tears, which I only have a proof copy for, which is here at the moment, starts in 1572, when our family, and I won't say who's in the family, because obviously you have to if you want to read The Burning Chambers, it would give it away. But the family is trying to decide whether to answer an invitation to go to Paris for a royal wedding. And that royal wedding is the wedding of Henry of Navarre to Marguerite, Margot, the daughter of Catherine de Medici. And anyone who knows anything about French wars of religion will know that the one notorious engagement is in Paris in August in 1572, the massacre of the Huguenots. And it is the turning point in the wars of religion. There are 8 different wars, but that is when it goes from being something that is solvable to being something that is sort of total destruction on both sides. And so, of course, anyone who is reading it will go, don't go to Paris, really don't go, you know. And it was very challenging writing that because of my family get to Paris. And I didn't know who was going to make it out of that massacre, because they can't all survive, because almost everybody in the Huguenot higher echelons was massacred. And then the City of Tears is actually my name for Amsterdam. Many of the French Huguenots fled to Amsterdam and were given refuge there. You'll all know that the word refugee comes from the French réfugié, which means precisely that. And because Amsterdam and the Netherlands accepted so many Huguenots in, oddly, they became a world power, because the Huguenots were, if you like, the French middle class, by and large. They were the lawyers and the architects and the bookmakers and the bookbinders. And so all the countries that they were taken in by, which were Protestant countries, had an enormous boost to their economies, essentially. And tiny little Netherlands went being, as you know, world power in the 17th century, a sea power. So my family flee and are given refuge in Amsterdam. And of course, are always yearning for France. They don't know what has happened to some of their families. It's a lost child story. I won't tell you which child is lost, which was quite challenging to write. And it does also go to Chartres. So anybody who's listening who's read Labyrinth will know my love of Chartres, and Chartres appears in Labyrinth. And I've long wanted to go back to a different period of history in Chartres. And it was, The City of Tears was enormous fun to write, actually. And then the third book, which I'm now working on, because obviously the second one hasn't yet come out, will be in the Canary Islands. Because strangely, you know, you could see a wine theme coming here, you know, Languedoc wine, South African wine. One of the great wine producing countries in the 16th century was the good old Canary Islands, Tenerife. Much of the wine that's mentioned in Shakespeare is Tenerife wine. It doesn't have a French history, it of course has a Spanish history. But my people, many of the ships that went down to South Africa stopped in the Canary Islands. And I love the Canary Islands, and I've always wanted to write something there, but there's never been a story. And then suddenly it was like, the north of Tenerife, that's where all the ships came in to restock before they did their next bit. And we will end up at the end of book 3, landing in Cape Town, in Cape Bay, which will be fantastic, because I've been itching to actually get there. And, you know, it's taken me obviously 10 years to actually get to them finally setting foot. And then we are in proper adventure territory land, obviously. And my tribute to my lovely dad and Ryder Haggard will come into its own. And we will be galloping through the Cape winelands towards the climax of the whole series of books.
Sounds absolutely amazing. I simply can't wait to get these books and to read them. So, but perhaps you could just do a little taster of, I think you said you're going to read a paragraph.
I'm only going to read a paragraph. And I've not read this really, because obviously the book should have come out in May, The City of Tears, but because of everything, they decided to delay it, thinking it would be back to normal in January, which it will not be. But we're still going to go ahead. So as Kate said, the prologue in each of the books, in The Burning Chambers and in The City of Tears, is set in Franschhoek. And in The Burning Chambers, the prologue, there is a young woman who is the descendant, we realise, of Minou, who is standing in the graveyard. And she has travelled over many, many, many thousands of miles to be there to find out the truth of her inheritance and the story between Vidal's family and the Joubert family. And we leave her, she is in the graveyard, when a man has just come and attacked her, essentially, and taken her away. So we don't know what has happened to her, but at the beginning of book 2, we discover that at least she is not dead. So Franschhoek, 28th of February, 1862. The woman is lying beneath a white sheet in a white room, dreaming of colour. Hier ruust. here lies. She is no longer in the graveyard, is she? The woman is caught between sleeping and waking, surfacing from a place of shadows to a world of harsh light. She lifts her hand to her head, and though she feels the split skin on her temple, finds there is no blood. Her shoulder aches. She imagines it purple with bruises where his fingers pressed and pinch. Pictures now how the tan leather journal fell from her unwilling hand down into the red Cape soil. That is the last thing she remembers. That and the words she carries with her. This is the day of my death. Right, that's it. That's all you can have.
It's so intriguing, and I'm sure many of us will want to know more.
That phrase, this is the day of my death, is the journal that she's carrying, that in the burning chambers we are there as those words are written. So it's very satisfying for me as a writer, having all of these, it feels like pulling all the threads in, the very first person who wrote those words, learning the descendants, and of course, for hopefully for you as the readers, little by little, as we go through the generations of this family to discover who this one is, and who the man in the graveyard is, who is the man who has attacked her, and why.
Indeed. I'm hoping that Peter may have some questions from our audience for us.
I do. Thank you both. Kate Mosse, that was fantastic. Thank you, Kate Harris. Thank you for doing such a wonderful job. Yeah, I've got several questions. The first one, I've got to do a little bit of a preamble. I was lucky enough to meet Kate Mosse back in, I think, 95 or 96 when her first novel came out, and she did a book tour with some other first novelist writers around the North, and I was the journalist for The Independent, and I accompanied them on that and heard a reading from this first novel. But also I always remember in the minibus, which is what we're traveling around in, she was forever on the phone in the back of the van, setting up what was then a different name, the Woman's Prize for Fiction.
That's right.
It never seemed to stop working. However, this question is related to that because it's from Janet Howe, and it says she loved Eskimo Kissing, which was your first novel when it came out. Do you recognise that Kate Mosse as the same person that you are now?
That is a lovely question, Janet. Thank you so much, wherever you are on this screen. No, and it's one of the reasons, and I'm delighted that you loved the novel, and I was really proud of writing it. But that one and the one that followed, Crucifix Lane, I've deliberately just kept out of print since then, because what I feel I did in those novels was that I had been a publisher. I was setting up a big literary award. Like Peter, wrote a lot about writing and culture and all of these things. And I did the absolute worst thing you can do as a novelist, is that I thought that the books that I read, the reader I was, would be the writer I was. And so when I was writing my first couple of novels, I was always on my own shoulder, kind of criticizing myself, saying, oh, that's not really very good, this isn't very nice, whatever, rather than what you need when you're a novelist is writing from the inside out. You have to let the story and the characters do the work, not you sitting from the outside making judgments. And so I don't think those first two novels, for me, I didn't find my voice. And it was only by, as I said, with Kate, we'd go into Carcassonne, even though we'd gone there before that, realizing that my writing was all about land and it was all about history. And that actually, I don't feel I'm a particularly strong commentator on the contemporary world. I'm less interested in what I can see outside of my window in fiction than I am in imagining the people that stood there 100 years ago or 400 years ago or 800 years ago. So I can see certain things, though, that I quite often see things in colour and black and white. So I write quite often about colour. Your question coming on the back of that is just so interesting, because I think the first line in Eskimo Kissing might be white is the colour of history, or I can't remember what it is, but that sort of thing. I also can see that I always wanted to tell stories about ordinary women and the men who love them. So that's very important to me. Good men and good women, and baddie men and baddie women, not all the men are horrible and all the women are great, because that's not the world either. So I could see that I had that in there. And I also can see that I like the long tail of history. So the idea that things that happened to people in the past influence how they behave in the present. But everything else, I think, I have Carcassonne to thank.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to switch the order of the questions I was going to ask because of that answer. This is Frank Bartram. The playwriting, do you need to take a different approach, given that your novels are based on landscape, as you were saying earlier? How do you process the playwriting, and do you lose out when you're playwriting from the vividness that your fiction has?
Thank you, Frank. That's a really superb question, and one that I have been wrestling with. I have written an adaptation of my own novel, Taxidermist's Daughter, for Chichester Festival Theatre. I suspect, since we're all Sussex people, many of you will come to Chichester or will know of it, of course, at least. And that was my biggest challenge. Firstly, there's not that many words in a play. And, words. And that was like, and I'm very helped by both my husband, but also my son, who is an actor. And he'll often say, Mum, they can do all of that paragraph with a look. And you're like, God. And then a huge amount of my writing is description. And that is not my job as the playwright. My job is to create the story and the narrative and the moment. And it's the designer and the director and the lighting design, the sound design, the choreographer who provide a lot of what is traditionally my description. But because I'm adapting from my own book, you know, some of it, I could just put a tiny thing, you know, on the marshes, midnight storm, but that's all I'm allowed. The biggest thing that I found a challenge is, of course, plays are enormously complex, and it's why Shakespeare is still Shakespeare, that there's so much in it always, and you go back to it. And we all want, as readers who go to the theatre, to see wonderful, complicated theatre that makes us think and brings emotions to life. But actually, it has to be very simple on the page in terms of the script. And what has been a big challenge for me with adapting Taxidermist's Daughter, which is set in Fishbourne in 1912, and is a Gothic thriller, essentially, which involves human taxidermy and floods and things that are also going to be challenging to put on the stage, is to understand that I have to let go of a lot of stuff. So what feels to me like the texture of the novel has got to be let go because it's too complicated. You cannot have lots and lots of backstories. There has to be a very clear intent. What part of the Taxidermist's Daughter am I telling on the stage? I can't tell the novel. I've got to make a decision, right down to whose story is it? Is it my lead character in the novel? Is it her and her father? Is it her and the baddie woman who is not really a baddie in the, you know, all of these things. So it's taken me a long time to learn the language, but it's been the most wonderful experience. And Taxidermist's Daughter is on next year. It's scheduled for next year's festival theatre season, which obviously was all cancelled. And I'm very proud because it's my hometown and I live here and I was brought up here, that it will be the first ever new play by a woman on the main stage. And that the only sadness in that is my parents won't see that. If the reviews are terrible, I will be very glad my parents aren't here to see that. But it has made two things. Firstly, next time I will write a play, not adapt, because I think I've learned a huge amount. Secondly, it has improved my dialogue as a novelist because it's made me think about how many words an audience wants to hear, the clarity of those words. So not that there can't be nuance, but actually it's really been helpful for sharpening up the dialogue in City of Tears, to the degree that when I was writing it, my husband said, you know, darling, there's almost no description here. I don't know where we are. We've gone too far the other way. And I think that is a really good thing. It's why a lot of us as writers write in different genre, because often you can hone weaknesses in one area by working in a different area, and then you bring them back together, because in the end all you want as a writer is to each book to be better than the one before.
Yeah. Well, that leads in very neatly again into another question from a Pauline Moran, who's saying, does writing get easier the more you write, or harder, and the more successful you are, does that make it harder?
Thank you, Pauline. I think as a person who has been extremely lucky to have found a readership, and a readership that has stayed there, and therefore if somebody had ever said to me I would support a family and be my full-time job would be as a writer, all of us would laugh in people's faces. That's not why people become novelists. Nobody expects that. So I have been very, very lucky. So it would be ridiculous to say that it gets harder the more successful you get, because you must never forget that you're really lucky to be in that position at all. When I started writing, as you'd hope, Peter, you know, all of us start by writing in our spare moments, and they, you know, in the evening when the children have gone to bed, or before they've got up, you know, and all, you know, whatever your responsibilities are. There is a sense of not wanting to let people down. It's, you know, almost like my first question, which questioner, why I haven't let my early 2 novels be reissued, because I actually don't think my readership would find that, I think they'd be disappointed in them, because I'm disappointed in them, although I'm thrilled when people love them. So there is that. In terms of getting easier or harder, it gets easier because you know how to do it. I know that the first draft of anything that I write will be pretty ropey. When you're a new writer, you write and it's demoralizing because you assume that everybody else's first draft is terrific, but it's not. You know, writing is like everything else. You do practice and you get better. You know, nobody gives a musical child a violin and expects them to play the Mendelssohn violin concerto straight off. You have to do your scales and you have to learn where to put your fingers. And then you don't think about the technique because you can think about your interpretation. And so it is with writing, that the more skilled you become, just as in a technical way, and I am skilled because I was a publisher, so I know how to structure a book, things like that, the more that liberates you to be creative and imaginative. So the more writing you do, the more time you've got for your imagination. It doesn't mean that you don't have enormous despair. In the middle of every book, I'll come out and say, this book is absolutely hopeless. I think I'm going to have to stop. And my husband will say, 25,000 words. And then I'll huff off because he will be right. It's exactly where, but my friend Ian Rankin, it's page 67. Apparently his wife says, oh, you know, page 67. It's all, this is never going to work. There's not a book in this, you know. And we all have that moment. And the beginning is great. And then you have to just do it. And then you get towards the end and that's lovely. And then I do 3 drafts of all of my books. So it's a long commitment of time. And some days go better than other days. But I always have that thing, the comment attributed to Picasso in my mind, whether, you know, he said it or not. And he was asked very near the end of his life, when he was one of the world's, if not the world's acknowledged greatest living painter, why he still went every day to his studio to paint. And his reply was, when inspiration arrives, I want it to find me working. And that's it. I sit here at this desk every day, and some days are more fun than others.
We're nearly out of time, but there is one other question, if you don't mind me asking, but you need to answer it succinctly. You've
Okay.
almost answered it, because it sounds like you plan very carefully this quartet, if it's going to end up a quartet that you're doing now. Was that always the case with the longer doc trilogy? Was that all planned, all 3 in advance?
No, none of it's planned. No, it's more that I research the history. I have an idea of the sort of books I want to write, but I don't know within each book necessarily what the story is going to be. So I know the whole history I need to tell. I know I'm telling a story of 300 years and 2 families, but within that, almost anything could happen. And so with the Longer Doc trilogy, that was never a trilogy of books. We call it that now because they're 3 books inspired by Carcassonne. If I'd designed them to all work together, I would have made some different decisions, let me tell you. You know, some things kind of, you find you're a bit of a golden handcuff, you know. With The City of Tears, it follows on from The Burning Chambers. I'm working on book 3 now. When I was writing The City of Tears, I didn't expect it to be a lost child story at all. It was just, I found myself, and I thought, oh no, that's what's going to happen. And, you know, and that really took me by surprise and changed the way of things. And with book 3, all bets are, you know, all bets are off at the moment. I have no idea. I know who it's going to be in Tenerife, who we're going to start with, and how she will have got there. But what's going to happen after that, don't know. Because I think I've absorbed so much of all of this. It's just about having the courage to not over-plan. I think all of us have read books where you can see that they've been over-planned. It's kind of been a bit of a straitjacket. And I think as a writer, you need to leave yourself free to make discoveries, because when I'm excited about a discovery, my readers are more likely to be excited because the excitement goes on the page. Whereas if it's you're just going through, oh, you know, I said I was going to write this, now I'm writing it. I think sometimes that makes a book a bit dull. So I like to be a bit scared, like what's going to happen, but I don't know yet. So book 2 is done, so I know that one, but book 3. You know, I've told you all these things about Canary Islands and, you know, arriving in the Cape Town. You'll probably discover, you know, they're in the new world. Something.
It will be great either way. So I'm just going to just wrap up at this end, but then I'll pass back over to the two Kates to say their goodbyes. Thank you all for coming along and persevering with this Zoom. It's been great to have an audience for this. Waterstones would normally be selling the books, and they still are. 10% discount if you phone, and if you then can go and collect from Waterstones in Haywards Heath. If you have already donated to the Cuckfield Book Festival, which is a non-profit festival, thank you so much. If you haven't and you would like to, you can go onto our website and make a donation if you choose to. Thank you to all our sponsors. Thank you all for coming. And let me just thank the two Kates before I pass back to them to say their goodbyes. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Peter. Well, I'm terribly sorry about that. I should also say there is a special Waterstones edition. I mean, this is true. I'm not just making this up now on the back of having talked about independent booksellers as well, because Waterstones are fantastic, and you know, I'm a huge supporter. It's just about the high street for me. You all know what I'm saying here. So yes, anyway, so there is a special Waterstones edition, and I have spent the last 4 months signing what they call the tip-in sheets, which are the first page in a book, and have signed, I think, 10,000 copies, and they then get glued into the real book because we can't go on a book tour. So if you go to Indies or Waterstones, you'll get a signed copy, but everywhere else, not signed.
Excellent. Kate Harris, do you want to say goodbye?
No, just yes, just to say that was hugely enjoyable, Kate M. I learned a lot. It was a fabulous conversation. It felt like we were absolutely there in the room together. Couldn't possibly have been more fun. It has been an enormous privilege. And I will say thank you to the audience for being with us, and Peter for hosting and topping and tailing so skillfully. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Lovely to see you all. Bye.
Yeah, bye.